Yeah, last time I was here, I'm still one of the few users of Foursquare or Square. I checked in and said, last time you were here was in March 2020. Like, I remember that because we couldn't touch our own pizza from the bars. And there's lots of people getting onto the train in Cheltenham. Not sure how that went very well either. But yeah, it's been 3 years since I've been here giving a talk. I'm still Derick. I'm still European living in London. I am no longer the PHP 7.4 release manager because PHP 7 and PHP 7.4 is no longer supported since last December. So this is probably the last time that's on my slides. Will I do a next one? Who knows? I also work for the PHP Foundation on the PHP language. If you have suggestions for things to alter PHP, don't tell them to me. Add them as feature requests on the mailing list or something like that. But yeah, in the last year and a bit or so, PHP Foundation has been set up with a goal of paying some people to work on the PHP language itself to push it forwards. Last year we made a reasonable start. This year I think we'll ended up doing a lot more because all of us has now gotten back into the habit of doing these things. I also wrote Xdebug and PHP's datetime extension. If you have questions about that, feel free to ask me later as well. I like maps, I like beer, I like whiskey. I got one here. I picked a session beer, but the idea is that will be low ABV. Session beers in Bristol are not low ABV. I'm on Mastodon. Yeah, that gets before Twitter now, since also last year on a phpc.social instance. It's particularly focused on PHP language, which is actually really quite nice to see what all the other people that I never heard of are up to. And yeah, you'll see me talking about PHP related things more there than on Twitter now because can't be, can I swear here? Can't be arsed. Right. So what I wanted to talk about is basically, I can't talk about everything that is new in PHP 8.0, 1 and 2 because there'd just be too much in it. But what I want to focus on is a little bit on more of a integrated set of new things that have been added to PHP and then specifically focus on PHP 8.2 related things more. So the first few, say half of the talk is more something about the last 3 years and then the last half about the last year or something like that. Now, PHP has been on quite a journey since PHP 7 and it's mostly related to making it more type safe, or to making it a more type safe language so that you can write better code, that it makes it easier to reason about. Now, one of the first things that we added, and I might not necessarily remember the exact PHP version that got introduced because it's been 3 years and I'm getting old and I forget stuff. But one of the things we added in PHP 8.0, I believe, is union types. Now, this is a contrived example where we have a class called number, and what we want to store is we want to store both integer numbers in it and floating point numbers. Now, normally I wouldn't recommend that you conflate these because they have very different reasons for it. But yeah, the way how you want to do it, like you want to set a number, if you wanted to have it both an integer and a floating point number, you couldn't do that in PHP, right? The only thing you could do is document that you're doing this. Now, documentation is great, and IDEs such as PHP Storm and VS Code and its plugins will tell you when you then use functions and methods wrong. But of course, it's much nicer if the language itself has these types and enforces them for you, which is what PHP 8.0 does with the union types, where you can use the pipe character to say, well, the argument that we're accepting can in this case be both an int or a floating point number. Now, these union types aren't only available for these static types, like I'm having here, like int or float, but you can also use class names or interface names or trait names, maybe? Actually, I've never tried that. Probably possible. So those are the union types. So that was the first thing that we've added. And this sort of started PHP going on a journey of making its type system a lot more interesting, a lot more descriptive, which makes it easy to write better code. Now, union types were actually not introduced to make it easier for people writing PHP code, but it was more of an interesting thing in the internals itself. Like with PHP 8.0, we also introduced a JIT engine in PHP. JIT stands for just-in-time compilation, or JIT stands for just-in-time, and then you have compilation, which is basically a way of taking a PHP code, analyzing it, and then converting it to something that your CPU can run right away. And often people think that by having a more typed language, it makes it easier to then create optimizations to then make it better to run things directly on the CPU. And as part of that, the PHP's internals added like flags to what different types of arguments could be. And we figured out quickly that PHP's internals aren't, or the PHP standard libraries, these functions, aren't necessarily designed very well. It's more organically grown over 26 and a half years I'm going with. I might be a year off here. And we have interesting functions like microtime, which has a argument called getAsFloat, which basically changes which type gets returned. It's either a string or a floating point number. The string contains the fraction with a space and then the full number. Whoever came up with that, I'm not sure. But PHP internally already has these union types, right? It was never expressed. But in order to be able to, well, that was the original idea, to be able to make it easy to optimize stuff, we had to have these union types. So they were first introduced in the language itself internally without you being able to use any of it. But then, of course, it makes a lot of sense to, well, just expose it so that everybody can be happy about these things. So yeah, there's lots of these weird things where the argument to it changes the type on how things are returned. Terrible APIs. Please don't do that in your own code ever. Instead, just have different methods for these things, right? But yeah, we can't change that in PHP because the moment we change that, somebody else's code is broken. So we don't like doing that. So union types have a set of rules, like void can't be part of union. Void means the absence of a type. So that makes no sense to combine with a type. You can use question mark class as is equivalent to class or null. Some people still use that as their, how do you call that, coding standards. It's probably not that great, especially because there's some intricacies by using equals null as a default value and stuff like that. We also added the false type because it is used in PHP internals in functions quite a lot, like strpos. Either returns a position in the string where something is found or false if it couldn't find anything. That was a very, very common thing to have. What you can't do is you can't have redundant types. So you can't have bool or false because, well, it makes no sense, like false is always a boolean. Or object or whiskey. Whiskey is always an object. Whiskey is an object in some of the code that I've written. And so on and so on. The order is pretty much irrelevant, so you can int or string or int. Makes no difference. And we also added a array or traversable is the same as the iterable. We added that in PHP 8.0. I believe in PHP, I'm going to say 8.1, but it could have been 8.2. We actually switched it around that now iterable means array or traversable as an internal marker. It should be irrelevant most of the time. Now, as part of these things, many frameworks or libraries use read-only properties, or pseudo-read-only properties, where they set a private property string. I'll show you what the syntax is a little bit later. So they say we have a private property called a private property with a type string called name, and then they have a function getName so that you can read this value. But of course, outside of this user class, you can never set this property because it's a private property, which is sort of read-only, but in like a circumspect way. Now, PHP 8.1 adds a real keyword called read-only, which allows you to mark a property as read-only. But probably a better description of read-only is set once in the scope that the property is defined in. That's a lot longer, and the keyword would be too long for that, so we call it read-only. And it basically means that you can now set this property once, probably preferably in the constructor, but you don't have to. You can also do in factory methods. And these properties can only be assigned a value to once. If you try to do this a second time, you get an error because it's a read-only property. And it can only be initialized from the scope where it was declared, meaning that you can only do this from within the object that's defined a property. So in a method of the user class in this case. Now PHP 8.2 extends this to a keyword on the whole class. So you can mark classes as read-only. But this adds some additional constraints to the properties that you can have in a class. So read-only properties can only be set on typed properties. So you can't just have a public read-only name, but there has to be a type associated with it. Meaning that if you have a read-only class user, it means you cannot have untyped properties in your class. Or does it allow for dynamic properties to be set? And dynamic properties are such things as like you do this arrow property name that wasn't declared equals value. So these are not allowed in read-only classes either. Or when there are any untyped or static properties either. So there's some restrictions around it. These keywords are mostly used for value objects. Like you instantiate something with a set of values and you expect that object to never change. Now there is one issue here, is that if you clone these objects, you still can't change the values, which is a little bit odd. So there's currently some discussions going on that allow to add a clone method that allows you to override some of these properties, because that makes sense to use with a clone keyword. That discussion hasn't gone to full fruition yet, but I guess it's something we'll see being added in PHP 8 through, hopefully coming out at the end of the year. Now, going back to some union types, we have the union type mixed, which is, I'm not going to read the whole thing because that'd be boring. It's basically any other scalar type, including null, but of course not void, because that is not a value. Why do we have the mixed type? Well, sometimes you have methods that either accept anything and then also return anything or everything, one of them. But when you go through your code, and if you can't hint against that, you don't know whether you've already looked at the code to see whether it actually accepts anything and returns anything, or whether you just haven't looked at the code yet. So the mixed keyword is basically a marker saying, I've looked at this code before and I know it can accept everything or return everything, so we then don't have to look at this code again. Yeah, I'm not reading all the other points here. Right, so I showed you a little bit of a syntax earlier that was confusing. So let me illustrate that in a better example with something we call constructor property promotion. I believe that was PHP 8.0, or could have been 8.1. So I have my class here, whiskey, which you have seen before, but this time I actually started with an emoji, because that's a great way of naming classes. Would not recommend doing that. My favorite still is using a non-breaking space in a class name, because everyone looks confused. Why does your class name have a space in it? And in this case, I have these 4 properties. So I have public string name, it's the name of the whiskey, object distillery, it's the distillery, the age, and then a optional property called bottler, so people that put a whiskey in a bottle. But if you want to create a constructor, you have to do this thing, right? You have to, in a constructor, you have to accept the name, the distillery, the age, and the bottler, and then inside the constructor, you have to this name equals name, distillery. It's lots of boilerplate code, isn't it? So yeah, the name of a property is in there 4 times. The type is in here 2 times, and then you have all these assignments. This is not a very nice thing to do. So what we allow with constructor property promotion is to basically, if you set the keyword in your argument declaration to the constructor, it will automatically declare property that is called name of type string and is public. Same thing for the protected and private properties. And it will also, in a constructor, automatically assign these values. Now, if some of those you want to override, you can still do that in the body of your constructor, which I've condensed here to opening curly bracket and closing curly brackets. Very useful feature. Again, very useful for these value types that are also useful with the read-only keyword. Now we have the following. Some of my whiskey note-taking app that I've written, and you can look at on the internet, I sometimes want to search for stuff. And as part of the search results, I want to return sometimes more information than other times. So if I want to see the distillery and the description of the whiskey or the tasting notes, I have options for that, right? So for that, I have this settings object. It actually has a different name, but it doesn't matter. Now, if you instantiate that with these options, so if you see this line, settings equals new settings, true, false, If you see this line, what do true and false mean? I mean, you can't see that. It says true or false, right? You need to refer back to the class definition or the constructor to see what these things actually mean. Similarly, if I want to create a settings object where I only want to change the sort by field, I have to do something like this, right? I have to duplicate every single value, every single default value that the constructor accepts. I don't like that. And many other people didn't like that either. So what we currently have is something called named arguments. So named arguments are a way of only setting the value of a specific named argument. So if I want to keep all the default values and I only want to change the description, I can set that to false by specifying like this. Now, some things I have to say about these named arguments. Sorry, one more example here. So if you want to change just a sort by field, you can just specify that one. Now, by introducing named arguments, that does mean that your argument names are now sort of part of your API if you create a publicly consumable library, because if people call your methods with this named argument, you change the name of the argument, you can now no longer set it. So I think you need to be quite careful about where you use these named arguments. My advice would usually be only do it for classes like this. Don't go overboard with it. And if you consume a library that you have no control over, you either need to know whether the library has made the dedication that they're not changing the arguments, they consider them part of their APIs, or you should probably not use them. Now, these named arguments also work for everything in internal PHP functions like strpos and the date functions and the mysql function, mysqli functions and things like that, which meant that we had to go through all 3+ thousands of them to make sure that their naming was consistent. That was a lot of work. The intention is that the naming are consistent per extension. So you can't necessarily expect that the names of arguments for the PostgreSQL extension would be the same for the MySQL one, but at least inside an extension, they should all, every needle will be called needle, every haystack will be called haystack. Which also sort of throws away the argument that you never know what is needle or haystack, right? Because you can't just now use a named argument to call them needle and haystack. You probably shouldn't, but you can. All right, next thing is enumerations. I'm going to say PHP 8.1 here. 1 second. Enumerations are addition to again strengthen PHP's type system. And it's basically a way of constricting an argument to only a specific set of values. Take, for example, currency. So my application only takes currencies in pounds and euros. Arbitrary example, I could have picked Japanese yen or Chinese won or whatever else you can come up with. And these enumerations are sort of internally implemented as as an objecty thing, which means that you can also use them as a type in type hinting. So I shouldn't say type hinting anymore, type declarations, because they're more than a hint, because they're enforced. So if you say private currency, then if you call this constructor, you then have to specify the value of it. And you do that by using the double colon operator with the value name, which is this case here, with the name of the enumeration. And this is going to get typed again. So if you do this wrong, if you do it right, you get this as a var_dump. Now, the var_dump function has changed since this slide. I deliberately kept it in because internally, what the currency property includes is both the currency class enumeration as well as its value, which is kind of neat. Now, as I said, this is being typed against. So if you call EUR as a string, it won't work because this is not this enumeration value, it is a string. So you'll then get a type error because you're passing a string instead of an accepted value. Now, enumerations can also be backed by actual values. So what I've done here is use the pound sign and the euro sign. The rest of the example is exactly the same here. But then if you do a var pivot, you see that it's backed by a string. I mean, not the most interesting example, but it is a kind of useful, because what you can do is you can then access the value property of the enumerations to then get the backed value out. So if one of your arguments in your method accepts a currency argument, then you can then access the backed value by using value to then use it for display purposes, for example. Similarly, you can create an enumerated value from its backed values. So if you do currency from, which is a static method that is defined for you, you can't override it. You'll get an error if you do so. And you do that with one of the backed values, you then get the enumerated value that matches that backed value back. If you do one that doesn't have a backed value, you'll get an exception. And in order to avoid that, there's the try from method. So if you try to use try from with a backed value that doesn't exist, you get null instead of the enumerated value, instead of an exception. Kind of useful. Enumerations, because they're pretty much classes, can also have functions. So in this case, we have the function format. We give that a number. Let's call it an amount of price. And then depending on what this is, which is either currency :GBP or currency :enum, :EUR for euros, it then returns a different pattern. Match is also a new feature in, I'm going to say PHP 8.1. That is basically a switch, but it returns a value. So on the left-hand side, you have the cases, and on the right-hand side of the arrow, you have a expression that is assigned to the pattern if this matches the value on the left-hand side. Very neat for things like this. Because this always returns a pattern, you can then use sprintf to then format the amount if we want. So if we have a currency GBP, we will use the pound sign before the number, and otherwise we add the euro sign behind it. Like if you do currency GBP and then you call cur format on it, you'll get the pound sign first. Similarly, you can of course create static functions to enumerations that then, depending on this case on the locale, which area you are in with language, it then returns a specific enumerated value. Now, I messed up. Well, when I wrote the slide, I sort of messed up. It is now a little bit more useful. It's because UKGB is not the right code for English in Great Britain. It is Ukrainian Great Britain, which is quite a nice hint here. So that's why I didn't fix the slides, to be honest. And then, yeah, when you call that from locale, you can get the value and get the back value again. You can also list all the values by using cases, which basically this gives you an array with all the enumerated values. You can also, not do this. So if you want to create a global constant, in this case prices, where I say currency EUR is 19.99, if it's pounds, it's 17.99, back when the exchange rates were a little bit better. You can't do this in PHP 8.1 or PHP 8.2 because a constant expression, it says, contains invalid operations. Because you can't, on the left-hand side, have a enumerated value. What you can, however, do is now in PHP 8, I'm going to say 8.2, you can access the value property. So this is a fetch property features of static things, but the only place where this works is for enumerated values. Originally, the intention was to allow this for everything in PHP, where this would be reasonable syntax, but nobody could find a use case. And there are so many edge cases that we decided just not to implement it. But it makes a lot of sense with enumerations, so that's why it works here. Yeah, we got the never type. The never type is only a return type. You can't type that for an argument, because that means you created a function that you can never call, which is a bit pointless, because then why have the method? but it makes sense as a return type. It basically indicates to the PHP engine that this method can never return. Of course, by calling exit, this method never returns because PHP exits the script at that time. Similarly, if you do a throw exception, the exception gets thrown, but the end of the function is never reached. If you do end up leaving the function in a normal way by either a return or when it hits the end of the function or method, you'll get an exception because you then get either an explicit or an implicit return value, which you can't do because this function is never supposed to return at all. It also works indirectly. So if you have a redirect to login page with never, then redirect login because we know this one never exits. This works as well. This feature was mostly introduced for like static analysis tools that make infer more information around this and tell you in great detail that your code is worse than you thought it was most of the time. But yeah, the PHP engine enforces all these types for you as well. Right. Now, in PHP 8.0 we got union types, and in PHP 8.1 we got something I'll tell you in a moment about. But sometimes what you want to do is that you want one property, I can call it both in this case, needs to be both traversable and countable. Now, you couldn't directly tell PHP that is that what you wanted, but you could sort of hack around this. Please don't ever write this in your own code, but I'll try to explain what it does. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a private property called traversable. This is optional and defaults to null. And then we have a both private property, which is document as being traversable and countable. Now, when we set both, because it isn't typed, you don't get any type errors. But what you can do is that you set the property traversable to be a reference of both. You do that for countable as well. Now, this means that if you try to assign both, it needs to both satisfy the reference to traversable and countable. And the only way how you can do that if your object implements both traversable and countable. This is a hack. Please don't use this. Instead, upgrade to PHP 8.1 and use the feature called pure intersection types, which allows you to type that right away. So yes, traversable and countable is now a way of requiring that a property or a argument type or a return value actually implements, in this case, both interfaces. And yeah, this works as you would expect it to work, which is always nice. You can only do that for class and interface names. You can't do it for scalar types because something can't be both an integer and a string at the same time. Makes no sense. And all the variant rules are respected, but are complicated. Well, it's not that complicated, but I'm skipping that for this presentation. Now, PHP 7.4, yes, I know we're talking about PHP 7.4 for a moment, is introduce a feature that allows you to unpack arrays with values. So if I have an array of apples, a red apple and a green apple, and I can use the splat operator, the ... with apples, which basically means for every element in the apples array, introduce them as a specific element in this array, and then you get your fruit salad, which is pears, peaches, and tomatoes. They're all technically fruits. I wouldn't put a tomato in a fruit salad. Maybe you want to. I don't know. So PHP 8.1 adds this with support for string keys as well. So that means that if you have an array apples and an array others, when you do the ... I keep hitting this thing. I don't want to destroy it. Basically what it does, for each of the elements, it will then introduce them in the array. And if keys are double, it will overwrite the one that already exists, which is the same semantics as the plus operator between arrays. Now the ... operator with string keys is actually quite useful, not for creating all kinds of weird fruit salads, but mostly because with named arguments now, if you do the ... operator with an array into a named argument way of calling arguments, it will actually use the names of the array keys to assign the values. So that's the reason why the dot 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 operator now works with string keys, because if you didn't do that, if this wasn't supported, it would use the keys 0, 1, and 2, for example, which of course are not names of the arguments, and you get an error for doing that kind of things. So yeah, this is sort of adds to the functionality of the named arguments. PHP 8.1 also introduces something called fibers. They are a way of cooperative multitasking. That's a big word. Basically what this means is that it allows multiple execution threads in a PHP script, but they won't run at the same time. Each of these threads, they're not actual threads, they call, coroutines would be maybe a better name for them, allows, when it's done doing some processing and when it's waiting for, say, input or output network traffic, say, well, I need to wait for something, some other thread can take over. So that's the cooperative part of the multitasking here. Any of you are familiar with how Windows 3.1 did cooperative multitasking? Exactly the same way. However, I don't ever want to think about Windows 3.1 anymore. A few other nice things. There are sort of the smaller features that came in PHP 8.1 and more likely 8.2 now, is something called the First Class Callable Syntax. Now in PHP, a callable is basically, can be multiple things, but it could be a string of a function name. It could be an array that had the object reference, in this case this, and a private method, or the name of a method as the second element. But this actually does not work. Because what happens here is that if I call new test, fine. I call new private method test get private method, which would then return an array with this private method. But when I then call this private method here, I'm calling that on this. There is no this, right? So you then cannot call the method and you'll get an error. Now, PHP already had this syntax where you can return closure from callable, which then creates a closure that is bound at that specific time to this, meaning that at that moment it will do the checks for private or protected. And when you then call the private method, you can call it because this scope is already bound to the private method, so you can do that. However, very long and cumbersome to write. So PHP 8.2, I believe, introduces another dot 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 operator. Yes, we do use we like adding dots to our code quite a lot, which is pretty much the same thing as the line you just saw above and behaves in the same way. Now the syntax, the dot dot dot, is pretty much syntactic sugar. It basically rewrites this into this. Well, it doesn't rewrite it, but does the same thing in the engine. Or the same thing with this method. It does closure from callable, and it also does it for like static methods as well, if you want to do that. Or pretty much any other syntax that you can think of, even the ones that fallen off the slide. There's one or two more, I think. I think this is kind of useful. I think the original intention was to also allow for partial function applications. So if a function, say, not strling, that's a bad example because it only takes one argument. But say str_pos, what you could do is you could then do dot 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 comma and then say 2 to get the second thing in a string. To have like a closure that already partially has filled in some of arguments. That never made it into PHP so far yet, but I think at some point that feature of partial applications, which is something that is quite a lot used in functional programming, might come back as a feature in PHP 8.3, 8.4, who knows? Maybe PHP 9. So when I talked about the union types, I mentioned that we had the false type, but I didn't mention that we also added the true type. So PHP 8.2 adds a little bit to this. Like for example, before false could only be used as a part of a union, string or false. You couldn't just use false as a return type. To be fair, that's pretty useless because a return type of false basically means your method only ever returns false. And similarly, accepting an argument that is typed as false is also kind of pointless because you can always only pass in false. However, the same thing was true for null. Null could also only be part of a union. And we actually found out there's a few cases where that is actually annoying. Like, for example, if I have a class userFinder that has the function find user by email, you give it a string, and it returns either the user, if it found it, or null. Now, sometimes in testing situations, you might create a mock userFinder. This one says always null userFinder, which is an extension of it. And then this find user by email could only ever return null. But because you couldn't use null as a standalone type, you couldn't actually express it in your code. Whereas in PHP 8.2, we now add this null and false type so that you can do this kind of things, which makes the whole typing system a little bit more consistent. We also had no true type. We only had false and null, but not true, because PHP's internals, or PHP internal functions, never needed that. But we like to be consistent. So now we have the true type as well as the false type and null. All right. PHP 8.0 introduced union types, which is the type is either this one or the other type. PHP 8.1, as we've seen earlier, introduced the pure intersection types. The word pure is somewhat important here because it means that if you have this argument, say, that needs to be part of both of these interfaces in this case, it can't be that or something else. It has to be either, or rather, both of these interfaces. Whereas sometimes you want to have it implementing either traversable and countable or an array, for example, which is an API that you see quite a lot. So PHP introduced something called DNF types, or disjunctive normal form types. You can understand why we call them DNF types, because it's a lot faster to say. Which is basically a way of doing a combination of intersection types as a union. So any intersection can be ORed to form a union. An intersection can also be a single type, because an intersection of a single type is just the same as an intersection of a single type. So we can do array or these other things. What you can't do is the opposite. You can't do array and traversable or countable. Then again, that isn't very important to have as a feature, because you can alright rewrite that as a disjunctive normal form types. It decreases the complexity in the engine for types quite a lot. Now, you can use this for property types, for argument types, but also for return types. Nobody has. I was waiting for the fingers to show up. That's why I was pausing there. Yeah, I made a typo here. This I'm missing the pipe sign here. Yes, it's not an array that contains traversables or countables, which would have been a great feature to have. So we're actually looking at something like that for PHP 8.3 to be able to define an array or something else like that, that each value and potentially also its key needs to be of a specific type. Maybe, I don't know. We haven't started talking about that. Oh yeah, okay, this is my fault. My original slide deck runs on PHP 8.1, and of course this is PHP 8.2 talk, so what waiting for my mouse to work. What I should have done is add the right port number there. Right, PHP 8.2 has a new random extension. There's a whole lot of very complicated things in there. There's different engines, yeah, with names like, should I try to pronounce that? Koshiro 256 ***. I mean, it only spells out *** because you can actually use a star as a class name, I suppose. There are a whole bunch of different randomizing engines in there. Do you need to know about that? Probably only if your random number generation should create the same sequence of random numbers depending on a seed that you need to share with another service. In most cases, you don't need to do that. So if you create your randomizer class, which does all the random things, if you don't specify an engine, it uses just one that you can rely on to just work. It's a C Spring. Don't ask me what that stands for. But yeah, there's a whole bunch of, I think there's 3 actually, randomizing engines in there that you can give a seed value. I like to pick 42. You can either pick a number, or I think you can do a string of 8 bytes. Exactly why that is, I don't remember either. But in most cases, you'll just leave out your engine and you just get nice random stuff. So this is guaranteed to be correct. What correct means, we'll have to leave for later. But it's kind of useful what it can do. Is like, you just say, I want 8 random bytes. How would you do that before the randomizer extension? Well, you have to call random a few times. Make sure that the range is between 0 and 255, and then convert it to a character, kind of cumbersome. So no, you can just do get bytes, say I want 8 bytes, and then you'll get 8 random bytes. I'm using bin to hex, otherwise it would, of course, mess up the layout of my slide. Similarly, like if I call getInt, I want an integer number between and including 1 and 100. In this case, we get 62. There's also one called nextInt. That basically just gives you a integer. But the next comes from the internal way how these randomizing engines work. To be honest, I don't understand the theory, but I don't need to either. What also is nice is there are some other functions that work on arrays in there. Like if you have an array of fruits, we have the red, green, and peach. You can do pick array keys, and it will pick you the number of array keys you want from this array. And then, of course, you can access the array through these keys, which is actually kind of clever to have. In this case, it returns the keys red and pink. Similarly, you can do a shuffle of the array, which of course modifies the array internally. And you then get your fruits in a specific order. Or you can do shuffle bytes, which you give all the values that you wanted in a string, and then it shuffles it in a interesting way at the bottom. Of course, when I reload the slide, you get different values because this is random after all. That doesn't work in the PDF version of the slides. Now, I mentioned when I introduced the read-only type for classes introduced in PHP 8.2 is that it would also disallow dynamic properties, like you can't set properties that are no longer defined. And this has actually been formally deprecated in PHP 8.2. I was, I believe, the only person that voted against this feature. I've changed my mind since then, because I was upgrading some of my own code to PHP 8.2, and it threw me a warning about this code. You want to know why? Can you see why? Because the person who wrote this code didn't know how to spell pallets, and in that indeed spelled it like a different kind of pallet. So yeah, this threw an error. And this is the error that you'll see in PHP 8.2. Says creation of dynamic property is deprecated. Now there is a few, of course, legitimate use cases for dynamic properties. So there are 2 ways to disable this deprecation, which you can either do by extending your class from std class being a built-in PHP type, you can only use with dynamic properties anyway because it's already defined for you. Or there is an attribute that you can set on your class that says, I believe it's called allow dynamic properties. It's a very well-picked name, I would say. And of course, I had to make a fix in my code by spelling palette correctly. So yeah, I've changed my mind on this. I think this is actually kind of useful. I thought it was a deprecation just for the sake of adding some strictness to PHP, but I've now found more than one occasion where this actually found a bug in my code, where this is, of course, more important if it was a typed property. Because if it was a type property with a misspelled name, it wouldn't also enforce a type, of course, because it didn't have a type associated with a property you just created. So yeah, this, I fixed a few bugs with this, so I was pleased with it. Something else in PHP 8.2, which I think is very useful, and the use case of this was kind of interesting. Somebody who still works, I think, for a company that creates a software product that lots of, say, lay people install. And these lay people, they sometimes run into problems, like anybody using a framework does, of course. And they were discussing on the forum how to fix these things, and I would just post the stack traces in them. But the stack traces include your database password or your AWS keys or things like that. And of course, you don't want to share this with the rest of the world, right? So he suggested that, well, maybe there should be a way in PHP to attach a attribute to arguments to mark them as sensitive. So when a stack trace happens, the values of these arguments don't show up in the stringified version of the stack traces. So when I would do this, I throw this new exception, you will now get, instead of the password, the secret elephant password, you get an object with sensitive parameter value. Now, if you see this in something converted to basically text, you will only see object sensitive parameter value. But PHP also has a get backtrace function, which also exposes the arguments. And in these cases, one of the arguments is now this sensitive value wrapped inside of an object, which allows you to still access the sensitive value, but you need to take an extra step to do so. In Xdebug, I have also implemented this same feature, but instead of it being wrapped in an object, it just shows you a string. For Xdebug, it makes no sense to wrap it in an Excel object because it has no API to get to the value anyway. So I just mark it as a string as sensitive parameter. Now, that does not mean that if you're step debugging through your code, you can't see these values. You absolutely can still see these values because, while debugging, of course, you do want to see those. All right, that's sort of what I had to talk about in PHP 8.0, 8.1, and 8.2. Maybe some hints to what PHP 8.3 has to bring. I've definitely not covered everything because there's simply too much in here. But if you have any questions about what I've shown you or other PHP new related things, then now's your time. I'll start at the back.
Are there any RFCs you're looking forward to in PHP 8.3 or not?
Are there any RFCs I'm looking forward to in PHP 8.3? Well, personally, I've been looking at a RFC to finally introduce proper Unicode strings. So I've been starting to work on that. So I'm looking forward to developing that idea to see whether this is something that we'd like to have in PHP. Text processing is really difficult. Many frameworks have implemented their own string classes, but they don't always work in the same way. Also, because they're all implemented in PHP, they are not particularly very fast. So having something like that always available in PHP for everybody would be a good thing to have. What else are we looking at? There are some rumors that people are looking at generics, for example. Where that ends up, I don't know. Beyond that, it's just the start of the year. PHP 8.2 has just been released, so there's not so much going on just yet. So I'm not sure what else exactly is going on, but it's also possible that I've forgotten about this. All right, next one. Yeah.
I've got a few. You know the backend, sorry, enum-backed value. Is there a limit to what types there can be? Can they only be primitive?
Yes, I forgot to mention that. It actually did say it on the slide. But... Oh, it didn't. Well, sort of. So the backed values you need to type. You need to say it's either an integer or a string. Those are the only types that you can do. The reason for that is because these are the same types that are allowed in array keys.
So array keys can be.
No, but that would have been nice. But no, not quite yet. But that would have been a nice addition to that. To do that. That was an original idea, but it didn't get there because sometimes PHP and edge cases is just too many of them. But yeah, the backed value can only be integers or strings. Good question. Yeah.
You could use the arrow value.
You can now use the arrow value from PHP 8.2 to then use them in array keys. That's true, yes. Or property names as well, I suppose.
And what will value be if you haven't given it value? Would it just be? Maybe
you can't. No, if you type it as a string, you need to back it. Yeah. There's no default values. Anything else? Yeah. Oh, sorry, you're just around the corner there. Oh, very bright light.
Can you do intersections with multiple? not just two.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, you can do intersection with as many types as you want. Yeah. Same with unions, for example. Yeah.
Secondly, there are some changes that seem to be related to the testing aspects, like facilitate testing, like returning false,
Yes.
allowing this. So isn't that if we have like code that there's false, there's not? Is that even someone say like that's kind of about design? You wouldn't need to do that. So why that's not getting PHP evolved language?
Okay, so I think there's another reason why you sometimes want to type a return value or an argument as just true or false. And that is either when you expect people to extend it to accept multiple types and the default is just false, or you already had an existing API that is changing because you drop functionality, so only false makes sense to pass in, where it originally was a Boolean. So there's a few other use cases there, which I don't think they are too great, but it being either true and false being part of union types is where this originally came from. So that's why it was introduced.
And the last one is about what you also disagree with originally.
What I disagree with
when you said why remove the
Well,
dynamic properties. So that's my last one. Honestly, isn't that like, okay, we're going strict type, that's it.
so that is an argument. That is an argument, right? Does PHP has to be a language that only works if you type everything, or should it still be allowed to just not care about types? And I'm sort of the later persuasion, like if you want to write dirty PHP code, you should be allowed to do so without the engine interfering. Whereas some other people say, no, you shouldn't be, you should only allow to write PHP code where everything is typed. So, or that was the original reason why I was against deprecating dynamic properties. Because I write lots of quick hacky code, which works perfectly well for what I wanted to do for. So I didn't want to be beholden to always having to declare my properties, for example. So that was my original reason.
Isn't that flexibility the whole part of a lot of people wanting in the first place?
I didn't hear the whole part of the sentence.
Sorry, isn't this flexibility that originally wasn't language that gave the opportunity to people coming into coding really instead of going, oh, let's go to Java and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. The PHP has always been easy to approach because it was always so lenient about how you'd use it, right? Like you can write PHP code still without any types, like I did a long time ago. Yeah.
Actually, regarding that with strict types,
Yeah.
most developers don't use it. I think just by looking at the stats of that.
Yeah.
When it comes to defining a function, you set your arguments up and you'll say this argument is a string, this
Yeah.
one's an integer. If you pass something into it, it basically casts it to that type.
Yes.
So if I was to put a number integer 1 into a string, it will get cast to a string.
Yes.
But in 8.1, null is no longer, it's like an exception. It's a very special case that null is now deprecated and eventually will become an exception.
For internal functions.
And both.
It was already for.
It was already, yes,
Yeah.
you're right. User functions, it was the exception there. Internal functions. So if you did string length on null, originally it will cast that null to an empty string and
Yeah.
then it'll say it's 0. Now it's going to go, don't like that.
Yeah.
And I'm finding that upgrading a lot of existing code, it's just like time bombs. And you know, the code that's been around for a year, running ADOT in a beta, you're still finding this stuff.
Mm.
And I don't know what the future is of that. You know, are we going to completely stop null being coerced? You know, when you concatenate the letter A with variable which may contain null, will that be rejected as well?
I don't know. I don't know what's I know what's happening in the future either.
It just seems like this is a deprecation which doesn't really seem to give anything, but is starting to. Yes, there's a deprecation now, so it's fine. It fills your logs with a load of errors, but you can ignore those. But when it comes to 9.0, and that's going to start throwing exceptions,
Yeah.
lots of people's code is going to start breaking.
Well, they also had several years to look at the log files, and I mean, this is another argument, right? I mean, everybody should have fully testable fully test-covered code. I mean, they don't. In that case, they run into trouble. But I would also say that many of these people wouldn't have typed arguments anyway.
But they're using the internal functions which are.
There now, yes.
Yeah, so for example, if you take a value from get post cookie, most frameworks will return null if it's not set. And then if you did a string length on it, or a trim's quite a common one, that suddenly becomes an explosion point. It will, in the future, 9.0, that suddenly become a, no, we're going to stop executing this point.
Yeah.
It seems very extreme compared to...
Well, I would say if you want to change this back, then you need to get an RFC accepted.
Yeah, I wrote it, but let's say the feedback was not positive.
Yeah, that happens sometimes too. Yeah. I mean, if any of you want to suggest any new feature to PHP, you need to convince many people that this is a good idea to do. And sometimes similarly good ideas also don't make it. And sometimes, luckily, very bad ideas don't make it. And there's some of these as well. Any further questions? I'm trying to skip to the last slide, but it takes a few. I went back too quickly.
I mean, some people might not know what Windows 3.1 is.
You lucky people. My first one was 3.11 actually, because it had the WinSock dial-up thing in it. Oh, the memories, the memories. Computers were already screaming at me back then.
Cool. Thank you very much for that.
Thanks very much. Only thing I wanted to say is that if you want to see the slides, you can scan this QR code. That should go to joined in maybe, I don't know. In any case, the slides are available on this URL here.